Well, as other people have said, I think we're clear, aren't we, that the problem isn't about the results focus per se. What I see as a major problem is the assumptions, and often unspoken assumptions, that are being made when people talk about results. Because they talk about results without being clear about assumptions we're making about how development happens, how external aid can contribute to it, what kind of social and political processes one's engaging with as an external actor in trying to promote development. And it's those assumptions that determine the judgments that you make about what's feasible and desirable and a good result in a particular context. And in most cases, in many cases anyway, those judgments are less self-evident than people like to think. So that I see the main problem as the results agenda being the kind of implicit assumption that the principal development challenges are lack of finance, lack of technical and organizational skills, and that somehow external actors are the people who can mainly provide these. And I guess I see as an example of that the speech that Andrew Mitchell made at the beginning of June at the Royal College of Pathologists, where he said not a word about local ownership of a development agenda or the role of local political choice in solving collective action problems. And the examples he gave I thought were quite telling, actually. One was about vaccinations, which is a case of an unusually strong causal link between specific monitorable actions and outcomes. And the other examples were about specific projects. And as we all know, you can get great results in the micro-environment of a project. The problem is how you sustain them over time and how you scale them up. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about these assumptions. And what I see working with a range of donor organizations, and the ones I've worked with recently include the European Commission, DFID, the Dutch, NORAD, GIZ, is an increasingly sophisticated debate that's taking place within those agencies about the kind of social and political processes they're engaging with when they think about what would be effective aid. And I see a big gap between that rather sophisticated internal debate and the external narrative with which many practitioners are really very uncomfortable, and which that external narrative is extraordinarily aid-centric and donor-centric still. And it focuses on short-term attributable links between aid and development without kind of making assumptions that we sort of know what those links are, which very often we don't. It's not just a tension, is it, between needing to be accountable to OECD taxpayers and needing to respond to development challenges as they really exist. I see the problem as a kind of fundamental lack of honesty about the way the debate is taking place in OECD countries. I wanted to give just a quick example of what I see as an increasingly thoughtful debate. And I was at a workshop in Lusaka recently with a range of the major bilateral and multilateral donors. And that internal discussion was confronting the really difficult issues that are fudged in the Paris Declaration, and they're really not addressed at all in a lot of discussion about results. And that is how you operate effectively in an environment where there's very limited local ownership of a development agenda, where there's weak capacity for effective collective action, where there are very strong political incentives to maintain arrangements that provide exclusive benefits to a small number of people. And the conversation in Lusaka centered on how you operate effectively in that kind of environment without compromising progressive principles and without unacceptable levels of risk to taxpayers' funds. But of course there's a nice judgment there about what is and is not an acceptable risk, and that in turn depends on the assumptions that you're making about the kind of process that you're involved in. So, as everybody always says, this is irritating, isn't it? Because there aren't easy answers here. But to my mind, effectiveness of aid really depends on how you manage those trade-offs. And if you think about development as essentially a local political and social process, then you're making those trade-offs between interests of OECD taxpayers and trying to achieve good, sustainable, long-term results. You're making them in a different way, depending on the assumptions that underpin your thinking. So there are, I mean, obviously, you're making trade-offs the whole time between the need to protect OECD taxpayers' funds and the risks that turning an aid tap on and off actually completely undermines any predictable long-term planning and budgeting processes in the country concerned. And you're managing trade-offs between donor objectives of prioritizing short-term poverty reduction and local political incentives which prioritize other groups and objectives, including, for example, political stability. And the Paris Declaration, to my mind, which is the basis at the moment of a lot of discussion of aid effectiveness, fudges that, because although it talks about the importance of local ownership, it doesn't say very much at all about what you do when it doesn't exist or doesn't exist very strongly. Can I finish by giving you just a little flavour of some of the things that were said at this Zambia workshop? Because I think it gives a bit of a feel for a different way of thinking about how you might operate effectively in the reality that you face in many of the countries we're trying to operate in. One strong feeling that came across, I thought this was interesting, was that the processes of formal dialogue that have surrounded giving of general budget support have become over-dominant. And they've crowded out more informal communication. And essentially, I mean, the formal dialogue that surrounds budget support, in a sense, almost necessarily tends to focus on things that are wrong and need fixing. And you have to have that sort of dialogue if you're giving large amounts of financial aid. But it's a problem if it crowds out either more informal dialogue or trying to look for a more compelling political narrative. So less about what's wrong and more about the missed opportunities and the opportunities there are for Zambia to become a middle-income country and promote growth and so on. So that was one of the themes that came out, and I think it's a discussion that's well worth pursuing. Another was that there is a lot of scope for longer-term indirect strategies that either increase awareness about damaging public policies. For example, a nice example I thought was a USAID-funded research program in the agriculture sector, where there was a very deliberate focus on trying to disseminate those results in politically aware and intelligent ways, including the fact that the head of the main dissemination effort was a former Zambian agriculture minister and former head of the Food Reserve Agency. So he did know his contacts. And when we asked him what he would consider a good result, he said, if he felt he'd got his messages across and really made a difference 10 to 15% of the time, that was a really good result. So it's an illustration of how judging what's a good result depends so much on the assumptions you're making about the kind of processes you're engaged in. There was quite a lot of support for the need to stimulate more public debate about taxation and building on strong common interests in tax reform, and a recognition that the rules of the game are changing for donors in Zambia. Zambia is much less aid dependent, it's much less willing to listen to lectures from DAC countries. And and an awareness that donors need to be very much more alert to how Zambian partners perceive their own interests and legitimacy if they're to have an effective relationship and even beginning of dialogue. So in short, what was coming out of this seminar was that effective aid means being less preoccupied with managing and in some cases micromanaging the supply of financial and technical support, and much more preoccupied with looking for where there might be short-term room for manoeuvre. A nice example in Zambia is the work that the World Bank has been doing over several years on electricity tariffs, having abandoned the idea of pushing privatization of the main parastatal. It's been looking at more incremental, short-term, politically saleable solutions that increase tariffs as you make improvements in the main parastatal. A very strong feeling that actually the rules of the game are changing, and that this is an extremely healthy development if it means that donors come to terms with the fact that actually at best they're there as facilitators of local political change processes and not as primary drivers of development. And so I come back at the last to my main point, which is I think a lot of the answer is actually our politicians need to be braver about having a more honest debate in OECD countries about the very complex challenges that one's engaging with in the development agenda. And I think it's possible. Now, I don't buy this argument that Mrs. Jones can't cope with a more complex argument. I think Mrs. Jones is more intelligent than politicians often think.